I think this might be a good point to pause in our discussions and see if we can take an overview of this whole process of spiritual evolution that is so central to the Baha'i teachings. You know, in evolution generally, I think most people tend to think of evolution as a long, slow, steady, endless rise. But we know, in fact, that the evolutionary process is rather different from that. Indeed, it is a long, slow, steady rise, but then it reaches periods where there's a sudden leap, and then there's another stage following that. I mention that because that's the point, clearly, from the reading of the Baha'i writings, that humanity has reached today, or at least the process of divine revelation has reached. With the appearance of the Bab, what you could call the prophetic cycle in religious revelation came to an end. And that prophetic cycle, well, the iconic or emblematic figure that's been used in scripture in the past to signal the beginning of that process was Adam. Adam, in Baha'i terms, was not the physical progenitor of humankind, but he was the inaugurator of a prophetic series of revelations. And all of the other revelations have followed in due course, and all of them have been prophetic. All of them have spoken, apart from developing human character and spiritual consciousness, they have urged mankind to look ahead to the point at which, in the words of Jesus Christ, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, a profound change will take place. It will no longer just be the development of the individual soul. The point will come when mankind at last is able to establish a society on earth which reflects in its collective activities the will of God, not merely in the lives of some or most of its individual members. The Baha'i writings are full of references that you could draw on to study this phenomenon. The Kitab-i-Aqan itself, the whole book virtually is a discussion of these prophetic stages, and Baha'u'llah teaches us to look at them as stages, ascending stages, that lead us closer and closer and closer to the day of fulfillment. Abdu'l-Baha sums the whole, what you could call almost the Baha'i theory of history, up in a few, about 4 pages, as I recall, roughly between page 94 and 98 or so, in Secret of Divine Civilization. But the person who explores the subject most fully, and especially in relation to the history of society in general, is the Guardian. Most Baha'is, I suppose, when they think of the Guardian, they think of his translation of the scriptures, which is obviously the foundation of everything else, or maybe his creation or development of the administrative order, his plans that launched the teaching of the faith in different parts of the world, or the building of the administrative heart of the faith on Mount Carmel at the World Centre. The Guardian's work in training us to think historically is so woven into the whole fabric of Baha'i belief and Baha'i consciousness that sometimes you just take it for granted. You don't stop and think about it as a phenomenon in and of itself. But that's exactly what it was. He devoted an unbelievable amount of time and energy to helping us to think historically. The one book that he wrote, of course, is God Passes By, is the authentic history of the Babi and the Baha'i religions during that first century and, century of their existence. Then he translated a large part of Nabil's narrative. That is a staggering task. I don't think any generally people have no conception of the work that this must have involved, translating this vast volume, which itself is only about half of what Nabil wrote, into English so that it's available to the bulk of Baha'is in the world. And then he moved his attention also to the development of the Baha'i faith generally in relation to world history. And so you've got world order letters, in which he moves easily back and forth through the great episodes of world history in the 19th century through World War I and so on. And then subsidiary texts like, well, Promised Day Has Come, where the focus is more specifically institutional, religious, and governmental, and parts at least of Advent of Divine Justice, which tend to focus on American history. In any event, we, as we read these books, as we study them at summer schools and so on, we think historically, but we think automatically historically. I think I said that at an earlier stage in this series. Well, now we've arrived at a point in this whole process where we have to begin to shift gears. And what I'd like to do is to read one of the most exciting statements, in my view, that the Guardian, well, he made so many exciting statements, but this one is a very unusual statement, because what he does is to take a view, an overview of the whole of human history, well, at least of spiritual history, from the time of Adam to the ultimate golden age, or the completion of the golden age of Baha'u'llah's dispensation. So let me just read this to you. Now this statement was made in as I recall, in 1952-53, as he was launching the 10-year crusade. And in it, he takes a look at the whole of human history as a 10-part process. And he says that the process, because we're talking about the spiritual process, began 6,000 years ago with the planting in the soil of the divine will of the tree of revelation. So revelation began at this point, prophetic revelation. And he says it's passed through certain stages and must needs pass through others. The first part of this process, now the first part of a 10-part process, was the slow and steady growth of this tree of divine revelation through a series of progressive dispensations associated with Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and other prophets, and the sacrifice of martyrs during the course of this process. And we're talking here about, what, 6,000 years almost alone in the first part. The second part of the process was the fruition of the tree, to quote the Quran, that belonged neither to the east nor the west, when the Bab appeared as the perfect fruition and declared his mission in the year 60. So the second part, the first part, some 6,000 years, the second part are the few years of the Bab's life. The third part was the grinding of this sacred seed of infinite preciousness in the mill of adversity, causing it to yield its oil 6 years later in the city of Tabriz. Now we're talking here about the martyrdom of the Bab, and this is an event that occurred on a single day. So now we're talking about a single day at the heart of this process. The fourth part was the ignition of this oil by the hand of providence in the depths and amidst the darkness of the Siachal of Tehran. So now we're talking about a single night, the process. This is the fourth part. The fifth was the clothing of that flickering light. He's talking here about the formal declaration of Baha'u'llah to a handful of his followers at the Garden of Rizwan. The sixth was the spreading radiance of that light, shining with added brilliancy in its crystal globe in Adrianople. Here we've arrived at the point of the formal declaration of Baha'u'llah's mission to the kings and religious leaders of the world. The seventh was its projection from the most great prison in the course of the ministry of the Center of the Covenant across the seas. And we're talking now, we've come to the mission of the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha, taking it right as far as the Australian continent. The eighth part of the process, and here the typical modesty of the guardian comes into play. He talks about the eighth part as being the gradual diffusion of that light during the course of two plans, which he himself had created, to various countries of the world which it hadn't yet reached. And then he says, the ninth part of this process, the stage we are now entering, this is 1952-53, is the diffusion of that same light over 131 additional territories and islands in both the eastern and western hemispheres through the operations of a decade-long world spiritual crusade, whose termination will, God willing, coincide with the most great jubilee, the completion of the preparation for the election of the Universal House of Justice. Now, this is the point at which this document was written. He's writing it to the people who are going to go and do this, to literally plant the faith in every single remaining country and major dependency and major island and territory of the globe. And then he says, and finally, the 10th part of this mighty process must be the penetration of that light in the course of numerous crusades and successive epochs of both the formative and golden ages of the faith into all the remaining areas of the globe through the erection of the entire machinery of Baha'u'llah's administrative order, and so on. And here we're talking about at least 1,000 years. So what's so interesting about this, he starts with the first part of a 10-part process being 6,000 years. Then the next is the few years of the Bab's life. The next is the single day, the Bab's execution. The next is a single night with the illumination and with Baha'u'llah's beginning of Baha'u'llah's mission in the CHL, and the time extends farther and farther and farther through the work of Abdu'l-Baha and so on. And now this is written to people who are going to extend it throughout the whole world. And then the concluding part, again, we're talking in terms of centuries or perhaps millennia, it's not clear. I find the document so interesting because it gives us perspective. It's not only necessary that we have a sense of the spiritual evolution of the revelations of God and the transformation of human nature and so on. It's also necessary that we keep a perspective, that we know where we are at any given point and what's important at that point. And obviously, for the people who went out on these enormously difficult projects, pioneers during the 10-year crusade all over the globe, it was vital that they understood the importance, not only the importance of what they were doing, but the fact that these opportunities would never come again. Because if they hadn't done that, chunks of the world and large bodies of mankind would not have been exposed directly to the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So because of that ninth part, now we can look back and we can see national assemblies, local assemblies, institutes, the present plan rolling in all of these countries, and that all of that process in any given country, Uruguay or Senegal or whatever country you want to speak about, came through the work of that one person or a couple of persons who responded at that particular point. So the point of the whole thing, obviously, is to recognize the fact that the challenges now are for the individual. No longer are we in a period of history where whole nations and collections of mankind are going to fail to recognize the revelation of God. We're now in the day of fulfillment. This is no longer the day of prophecy. And it's up to the individual now in a far more mature way than would have been possible, I suppose, in previous periods of history, to recognize where the process has brought him and to take the decisions that are necessary to the advancement of the cause. And let me just conclude this by reading another passage of The Guardian, one that's one of my favorites, which puts this in perspective so far as the stage that we're moving steadily through now. He says, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, whose supreme mission is none other but the achievement of the organic and spiritual unity of the whole body of nations, should, if we be faithful to its implications, be regarded as signalizing through its advent the coming of age of the entire human race. This is what the revelation of Baha'u'llah brings. It should be viewed not merely as yet another spiritual revival in the ever-changing fortunes of mankind, not only as a further stage in a chain of progressive revelations, i.e. not just another prophetic religion, nor even as the culmination of one of a series of prophetic cycles, because it was the Bab that completed that cycle and opened up the new cycle. So this is something above and beyond this entirely. But rather as marking the last and highest stage in the stupendous evolution of man's collective life on this planet. The emergence of a world community, the consciousness of world citizenship, the founding of a world civilization, should by their very nature be regarded, as far as this planetary life is concerned, as the furthermost limits in the organization of human society. Though man as individual will, indeed must, as a result of such a consummation, continue indefinitely to progress and develop spiritually. So I thought this would be helpful before we move into the next stage of our discussion, when we want to take a look at the revelation of Baha'u'llah itself.